The biggest reason for me attending partnerships and clinical trials is to be able to meet with vendors who can help me understand the landscape of global clinical trials. My name is John Burnett. I'm a clinical research manager for J&J Vision Care. I've been in the industry for 20 years, starting off on the CRO side of things, working for Covance before moving over to the pharmaceutical side of things and biotech with Amgen and then Pfizer, before moving up to the Bay Area in Genentech, and then now finally, I guess, graduating, if you will, over to medical device with Johnson & Johnson down in Jacksonville. I'd say the biggest challenge for us is that we are doing so many trials so rapidly over the course of a year, and we actually have tighter budgets than pharmaceuticals. And by that, what I mean is it was nothing for me to work on a clinical trial in pharmaceutical or biotech with budgets of between $7 million to $14 million. But in medical device, a $5 million trial for us at J&J VCI is considered a big-time money investment. And the clinical trials in the pharmaceuticals, whether you're doing oncology or HIV, can be very long, especially with HIV and oncology, because you have endpoints that may be fatality or patients dying. That's the endpoint. So studies can drag on. But in medical device, things are happening very quickly. There's a startup, there's a clear time frame for things being done, seeing specific endpoints, and moving on and making determinations about those devices. So we do a lot more studies. Just in the last year, I did about 40 clinical trials all over the US as well as with a global reach. And I wouldn't have done that in pharmaceutical in the past year. I may have done like 10, but they would have been probably phase 1 clinical trials. And what I'm talking about is actually like the equivalent of phase 2s and phase 3 clinical trials, all being done very quickly, getting the results and getting studies over with under much smaller budget constraints. I think the big struggle has always been, for me, over the past year, is just keeping track of everything in terms of how it impacts things from a budget standpoint. Recognizing which metrics are really relevant and which ones aren't, and then being able to equate those with a financial component so that people can understand what the implications are of something going a little bit longer or things getting done quicker. So being able to now being asked to do more on the financial side, being able to take the information that we have and give proper projections about what's going to be accrued or what's planned from a budgetary standpoint is a lot more critical. And we're spending a lot more time dealing with that rather than just focusing on executing the clinical trial. I think a lot of times in the past, people have kind of used those two terms interchangeably. And by that, I mean like with metrics, they tend to talk about metrics and milestones interchangeably. Like a key metric people try to speak to is like first patient in. But that's not really a metric, it's more of a milestone. And it's, quite honestly, from an execution standpoint, an arbitrary milestone. It doesn't really signify the start of a study. Once you have your first site up, in all honesty, that's when the study has started. But because you want to start the study as soon as that you have the ability to enroll a patient. But the real critical milestone really is last patient in or last patient out, because that's going to dictate when you get your data that you can analyze. That's far more important from my perspective than when we get first patient in. I've done a few too many trials in which we've had this big push to get first patient in by the end of the year, and then by end of fourth quarter of a certain year. And you sweat blood, you cry tears of rivers, and step on people's toes to make it happen. You get first patient in on December 29th, and then next patient doesn't show up until February. It's kind of like, did we really achieve anything? Did that really help us? No, but the company could tell the street that, hey, we started the study at the end of the fourth quarter. So I guess that from a financial standpoint, from Wall Street's perspective, that's a good thing. From my end, well, you see what it's done with my hairline. With regards to specific language or common language, I think as an industry, there's a tendency to assume that everybody knows what you're talking about when you talk about first patient in. The reason why I say that is because from a pharmaceutical, medical device, or biotech perspective, first patient in is not just first patient consented, but first patient receiving treatment of whatever the investigational product is. If you're an IVR or IWR or EDC vendor or EPRO vendor, first patient in is the first patient in that is using your system. So they talk about the patient's enrolled, but that patient could have just been in screening. And that's not a big deal from the perspective of executing the clinical trial. So there needs to be, I guess, better communication at the start of a study and understanding what people are talking about. Because I've had a lot of times had those meetings where a vendor has made the comment, oh yeah, we'll be able to enroll the first patient on this date. And they don't have the clinicians looking at me with this puzzle look like, wait, what are they talking about? You know, that's like 3 weeks before the actual patient will be treated. And then you have to go through that whole explanation of, well, from their perspective, in their system, the patient's enrolled. But if the patient screen fails out, you know, that's no big deal to them. They're looking at how many patients are actually being used within their system. So making sure everybody has understanding and agreement about what the language is important. In terms of from a analytical perspective, for me, I have a tendency to try to break things down to what's measurable and what's not. And I try to want to look at the things that are measurable that I can make decisions on. To me, first patient in is not something I can make a decision on. Looking at how long it took from the site to get first patient screened or first patient enrolled after screening, that's something I can do something with, because then I can then inform the sites that are coming up, hey look, these are some of the pitfalls that previous sites have had to overcome, something you should watch out for as you recruit patients. But in terms of going forward, if I need to make decisions about do I need to bring on new sites, that's also information I need, because then I'd say, okay, a lot of times people say, oh, enrollment's behind, bring on new sites. Well, yeah, but then, okay, I bring on the new site, let's say they can use a central IRB so they can get up in 2 weeks. But if it's still going to take them another month before they can get their first patient, am I really helping my timeline at all? How soon will they really be able to impact anything? Is that cost involved with getting that site up, because you have to basically allocate budgets for that site to be able to, you know, handle their patients? Is that really cost effective? Or would it be more cost effective to employ a patient recruitment firm to help out the sites that are already up? Those are the type of decisions that you want to be able to make, and to be able to have that connection with the financial aspect with those analytics would be more helpful. Right now, I just haven't seen a system that allows you to really make that connection very easily. A lot of times it's get this information from over here in IWR or EDC, and then get this information from finance in terms of the financial aspect. And then I spend overnight with my wife getting irritated with me, turn off the light, John, before you go to sleep, in bed, figuring out how to make these two things work so that I can then tell a proper story to the clinicians or my boss about what needs to happen and what my recommendations are for conducting the clinical trial going forward. The challenge has been for a lot of service providers is that, especially like the technology providers, they're rightfully grounded in their technology and rightfully grounded in the programming of that technology. What would be great to see would be for them to take the initiative to bring on somebody with the background in actual clinical operations, so as to properly present the data that they're bringing in or that they're collecting. Because what they don't always understand is that, yes, they give us a great data listing, for lack of a better word, of the data that's being collected in their system. But then basically they're kind of giving it to us, and it's kind of like, okay, almost like a buffet table. Here's your food, figure out how you want it on your plate. Now granted, in a buffet, it's a lot easier to do that. On my end, I end up having to download those data listings, compile them, put them together, and then do some, I know other colleagues of mine do this as well, develop my own macros in Excel to figure out what information I really need, and then present it to the customers that I have to then meet with internally at the sponsor company. So If some of my vendors could, I guess, partner with us a little bit better. I know they've tried to, and the problem has been always timing. But I don't know if it's a conference or a 2-day offsite or something. There needs to be a better marriage there of understanding what we ultimately need the data to see, rather than just the provision of the data. I think a lot of times what happens is when we start talking or saying stuff about, well, can you do this with the report, we start hearing the buzzword of customization, which translates in our mind to more money, which probably is true. It probably is more money, but once we hear more money, we're automatically like, oh, you know what, let's give us the bare bones, quite honestly. And when you give us your bare bones, you're doing your job as a vendor, but from our end of it, there's still a lot of work that we have to do with that data that's being provided. I would love to have a vendor come to me out the can saying, okay, we know what kind of stuff you guys are doing. This is the type of calculations you typically do or that we've seen operations do. Here's our canned reports that are at least in the ballpark of along the lines of what I'm looking for to be able to make decisions. The day that happens, I may regrow my hair. So I feel like on every clinical trial that I run, especially the large global ones, I'm reinventing the wheel every time because I'm getting from the CRO a Excel spreadsheet or a spreadsheet of some form, even from their CTMS reports. It's basically a glorified Excel spreadsheet showing me the site, dates of approval, and yada yada all the way up through first patient in. And then I get from IWR the listing of when they were active, the sites were activated, how many patients are enrolled, which is great. But ultimately, I'm looking at information of what is the timing in that initial, the study startup tracker, timing of how long it took us to get from point A to point B. And then looking at that against what's been the enrollment rate at that particular site. Was it worth that time, that lengthy time, or was there somebody who was even better in terms of getting up quicker and getting enrollment a higher rate and versus their screen failure rate? That's the kind of information that I end up having to rebuild myself on any given clinical trial. The biggest challenge that CROs have facing and dealing with medical device companies is realizing how quickly things happen and how fast things turn around and how quickly things change on a dime. Medical device companies make decisions very quickly because their clinical trials are a lot shorter and they run multiple trials far more often than pharmaceutical companies. So things are happening very quickly, decisions are being made, projects are being terminated or continued, that could happen like 8 times within a year, as opposed to in pharmaceuticals, it's usually like, okay, we gotta wait for a year, and there's the, long-term efficacy and long-term safety. You don't have that much of a complication in medical devices. So I'd say the biggest reason for me attending Partnerships in Clinical Trials conference is to be able to meet with vendors who can help me understand the landscape of global clinical trials and the countries that my company is looking into going to. The big goal is that hopefully with the information they provide me, I'd be able to inform the company and educate them on what we need to do, what hurdles we need to overcome as we go into these new markets. At the same time, as their information is determined to be either very credible or more accurate than others, they put themselves in a position to work with us to be able to say, okay, that's the company we want to help us, guide us through overcoming those hurdles and those challenges.